My name is Tom Selby. I'm the head of retirement policy at AJ Bell, but today I'm coming to you as Shares Magazine's pensions and retirement agony uncle. So over the past 3 years or so, I've been getting and responding to questions from Shares readers about all sorts of retirement issues, from political issues like when will pensions tax-free cash be called at the next budget? That's a very common one. To one of the first questions that we had, which was from a clergyman asking, can I put my stipend in my stakeholder pension? So I'm going to be using today's session to take the 5 most common themes that we've had over that 3-year period in terms of questions from readers and turning those into questions we're then going to answer as we go through the session. As Roland mentioned, we'll have questions at the end, so obviously feel free to ask me any questions you want to at that point in time. Alternatively, if you'd like to ask a question which could potentially be featured in Shares Magazine, then there is an email address for that. I'll give that a quick plug now. So it's asktom@sharesmagazine.co.uk. Can't guarantee that your question will be answered. We do get quite a lot of questions, but I can guarantee that I will review your question if you send it in. So first of our 5, why does the Department for Work and Pensions tell me I'm going to receive less than £179.60 per week in state pensions? So a bit of background to the UK state pension system and why that might be the case. So since April 2016, people have built up entitlement to what's known as the flat rate state pension, also sometimes referred to as the new state pension, even though of course it has been in place for 5 years. So the full flat rate state pension is worth £179.60 per week in 2021-22. So that's just over 9,300 quid per year. However, as the question suggests, not everyone gets the full flat rate amount. So you need a 10-year national insurance contribution record to qualify for any state pension at all, and you need a 35-year national insurance contribution record to qualify for the full flat rate amount. Now, I mentioned that the flat rate state pension system was introduced in 2016. Of course, before then, there was a state pension system as well, but it was more complicated than the system we have. So I incorporated a basic rate state pension, and there was also an earnings-related part of the state pension system as well. So when the reforms were brought into place, and on the 6th of April 2016, the government had to come up with a way to honour those existing state pension entitlements. And so that was done through the calculation of a foundation amount, which may have been higher than the full flat rate of state pension, taking into account your entitlements previously, or may have been lower than the amount of the full flat rate state pension, taking into account what you had done previously. So that's another reason why potentially you may not be entitled to that full flat rate amount. However, as mentioned, not everyone's entitled to the full flat rate amount, but if you don't have the full flat rate amount, either because you haven't got enough a strong enough national insurance record, or you had a lower entitlement under the previous system, then it is possible to buy extra NI contributions direct from the DWP. You can buy an extra week of what's known as Class 3 national insurance contributions for £15.40. But remember, once you're up to that full flat rate amount, once you're up to that full 35-year national insurance contribution record, you cannot buy any more state pension entitlements. So £179.60, if you're below that amount at the moment, is the maximum per week that you can get in 2021-22 terms. So next up, and you would hope that this would be an easy question, but sadly it's not. How much can I save in a pension each year? So let's go through this step by step. So the minimum anyone can save in a pension scheme and receive tax relief is £3,600 per year. This is also the maximum anyone with no UK salary incidentally can save in a pension each year. Your personal pension contributions are also limited to your annual earnings. You can save more than that, but you won't get the tax advantage of doing it. So for example, if your earnings are £20,000, then the most you can save in a tax incentivized environment per year in a pension is £20,000. In addition, there's an overall annual allowance of £40,000 that comprises both your personal contributions, employer contributions and tax relief as well. So that's the easier part of the annual allowance. The slightly more complicated bit occurs if you're either very wealthy or you've accessed taxable income from your pension. So let's start with, if you've accessed taxable income from your pension, then that will trigger the money purchase annual allowance, and that means that the amount that you can save each year in a tax incentivized environment in a pension drops from £40,000 to just £4,000. There's also the tapered annual allowance, something you may have read about, particularly about 18 months ago, was causing a lot of problems for doctors in particular. So this affects people on very high incomes. So people with total threshold income above £200,000 and total adjusted income above £240,000 might be affected by the taper. Once you trigger that, for every £2 of adjusted income you earn above 240 grand, the annual allowance reduces by £1 to a minimum of £4,000. Now, I'm not going to go into detail today on how the taper works because we've only got 20 minutes and there's other subjects that I want to get onto. But if you search for YouInvest taper guide, there's an excellent YouInvest guide to how the annual allowance taper works and how it might affect you, which I would highly recommend reading. In terms of your annual allowance, one useful feature to know about if you're worried about the impact of the annual allowance on your ability to save for retirement is the ability to carry forward unused allowances from previous tax years. So if you've used up all of your annual allowance from the current tax year, then you can use unused allowances from up to 3 previous tax years to boost the amount you can save in a tax incentivized environment in the current tax year. So taken to its maximum, that could mean you could save £160,000 in the current tax year using up previous allowances if you hadn't used your allowances from the past 3 tax years. Now, a few caveats around using carry forward, which is a very useful feature of the system, but there are caveats. So your personal pension contributions, as mentioned earlier, are still restricted to 100% of your earnings. So if, for example, your total earnings were £60,000, then the most you could save in a pension using carry forward, if you had the allowances to use, would still be £60,000. So that personal pension contribution limit continues to apply. If you've triggered the money purchase annual allowance, which I mentioned on a previous slide, then you can't carry forward any unused allowances. That means you need to think really carefully before taking taxable income from your pension, because when you do, your ability to save is not just restricted to £4,000, but possibly if you're a very high earner, it could be restricted from £160,000 if you look at using that carry forward from the 3 previous tax years to the maximum. If you're affected by the tapered annual allowance, again mentioned that in the previous slide, then you can only carry forward the tapered amount from that year, and you must have been a member of a UK pension scheme in each of the years you want to carry forward unused allowances from in order to be able to use carry forward from those years. Okay, so the next one, in relation to the pension freedoms and the taxation of pensions withdrawals. So why have I been overtaxed on my pension withdrawal? A very fair question, and it all comes down to how HMRC's tax technology works or doesn't work in relation to defined contribution pension withdrawals. So I'm sure most of you know that when you flexibly access your defined contribution pension, a quarter of it should be tax-free, with the rest taxed in the same way as income. However, when you make your first withdrawal of the tax year, HMRC will usually apply what's called a month 1 tax code, and what that means is that your usual tax allowances are divided by 12 and applied to the withdrawal. Now, if you're making multiple withdrawals or you're taking an income, then this shouldn't be a problem. So HMRC should give you the right tax code, and then your the amount of tax that you pay should be adjusted over the course of the year. But if you just take a single taxable withdrawal, then that's when you're going to run into problems. So probably important to note that this just relates to taxable withdrawals. So if you take your tax-free cash, or indeed if you buy an annuity, then that's not going to cause you a problem. Now, this is one of those things that's probably a bit easier to show in an example, and we've got one for you here now. So Jennifer's already taken a 25% tax-free cash, and she has £100,000 pension in drawdown. She wants to take her income in a way that minimises tax, and so she wants to take out £12,570 in the 2021-22 tax year, meaning that she should, in theory, pay no tax, assuming, of course, that she has no other sources of income on the withdrawal. However, because it's her first taxable withdrawal, a month one tax code is going to be applied. It means her usual allowances are divided by 12, and as a result, she faces a tax bill upfront of almost £4,000. Now, there's various forms that Jennifer can fill out in order to reclaim that money. If she fills out the correct form, and you can see the details at the bottom of the slide there, then she should get her money back within 30 days. However, if she doesn't do that, then HMRC says she may have to wait until the end of the tax year in order to get the money that she is owed. Moving on to, and we've got a couple of questions here on the lifetime allowance. So this is the topic that I'm asked about far and away the most by shares readers, and that's a good thing in a way. It suggests that many shares readers have saved hard and have built up a decent retirement pot, but it also, I think, speaks to the mind-boggling complexity of the UK's pension tax system and the lifetime allowance in particular. So let's look at the lifetime allowance first and how it's tested. So I'm sure, again, most of you know the lifetime allowance caps the total amount you can save in a pension over your lifetime in a tax incentivized manner at just over £1 million. So £1,073,100, a nice easy number to remember. Lifetime allowance, you may have read, is going to remain frozen at this level until the end of this Parliament. That was announced by Rishi Sunak in his March budget as part of measures to save the Treasury money following the challenge that had been put to the Treasury by COVID and paying millions of people's salaries directly through the furlough scheme. So some people may have what's known as a protection, which means their lifetime allowance is higher than that just over £1 million figure. Each time, now this is where we get into some jargon, each time a benefit crystallisation event occurs, this will trigger a lifetime allowance test. Now, benefit crystallisation events, in the most part, usually mean turning your pension pot into an income in some way. So you can see some examples there, taking your tax-free cash, that's a benefit crystallisation event. So you take your tax-free cash, that will trigger a test against your available lifetime allowance, as will entering drawdown, taking out a lump sum, buying annuity, dying, or indeed if you die before your 75th birthday or reaching your 75th birthday, the so-called age 75 test, and we'll come on to that in a little bit more detail in subsequent slides. So let's just have a look at how that lifetime allowance test works for someone in drawdown. So Christian, 65 years old, is about to access his £500,000 pension pots for the first time, so a decent sized pension pot. He wants to take his full tax-free cash entitlement with the remaining £375,000 entering drawdown. So nice, simple example, and you can see here exactly how that lifetime allowance test works and how his lifetime allowance is used up. So the two tests that happen when Christian does this: firstly, he takes his pension's tax-free cash, so £125,000 tested against the lifetime allowance. The second test is the money going into drawdown, so the 375 grand going into drawdown. Overall, that means he's used up just over 46% of his lifetime allowance and still has just over 53% of his lifetime allowance remaining. So plenty of lifetime allowance left to use up. A couple of things that you might notice there. Firstly, the lifetime allowance, the percentage that's used up is always to 2 decimal places, and slightly confusingly, HMRC ignores mathematical convention and always rounds down the amount of lifetime allowance that's used. So regardless of where that third decimal point arrives at, that's what will happen when you use your lifetime allowance. So next up, the age 75 test, and this will link on to the next question that we have as well. So I'm often asked about the age 75 test, and in part in relation to how can a lifetime allowance tax charge be avoided, something that I will come on to briefly in the final part of my presentation. So it's worth understanding exactly how that age 75 test works, and so probably best to do it with an example, and let's keep using Christian for simplicity's sake. So After entering drawdown at age 65, his fund has gone up in value, so his investments have performed well. As a result, his fund's grown from that 375 grand we said earlier he had in drawdown at age 65 to 475 grand at age 75. So £100,000 all in of growth in the fund. So when he reaches age 75, that investment growth will be captured through the age 75 lifetime allowance test, another one of those benefit crystallization events we talked about in the previous slide. So it's relatively simple, actually, the way this works, although very frustrating for many investors who see this on as a tax on investment growth, and that's certainly something that we've made clear that we don't like to the government on several occasions, but that's always fallen on deaf ears, unfortunately. So the way it works is you simply take the value at age 75 and subtract the value of the fund when Christian initially put his money into drawdown. So 475,000 minus 375,000, £100,000 of growth tested against the lifetime allowance. That growth uses up just over 9% of his available allowance. Final question then, again on the lifetime allowance, because I know this is something that vexes lots of people. So a question I'm often asked is, how can I avoid a lifetime allowance tax charge, or variations on the theme of how can I avoid a lifetime allowance tax charge? So just as background, if you exceed the lifetime allowance, you will be hit with a lifetime allowance tax charge, as the question suggests. So if the excess above the lifetime allowance is taken as a lump sum, then that charge will be 55%, but there'll be no income tax to pay beyond that. If you take that excess as an income, then the lifetime allowance charge will be 25%, and then income tax will subsequently be added to anything else that you take off. Sounds hefty, but it's worth noting that the aim of that lifetime allowance tax charge is simply to remove the tax advantage you've had from saving in a pension. So while in many cases the age 75 is a big concern, I think often the question shouldn't be what happens if I breach the lifetime allowance. The question might be, should I be trying to avoid breaching the lifetime allowance at all? So if you take money out of your pension to avoid breaching the lifetime allowance at age 75, that could potentially mean that you avoid the charge over and above it. But of course, you will pay income tax on those withdrawals, and the money that you take out, if you don't spend it, will form part of your estate potentially as well. So there could be IHT implications. It's possible that you could, of course, as you approach your lifetime allowance, reduce the amount of investment risk that you take, and as a result, you could stay beneath the lifetime allowance and avoid lifetime net allowance tax charge. But again, it's possible that even with the lifetime allowance charge, you might be worse off if you're robbing yourself of good, strong investment growth over long periods of time. And so, as I say, in many cases, it might be better simply to wear the lifetime allowance tax charge, take it on the chin, accept that it's part of the system, but understand that you may overall be better off as a result. I would caveat all that by saying this is one of the most involved, complex areas of retirement planning. I think if you're approaching age 75 and you're considering doing things to avoid the lifetime allowance tax charge, I couldn't urge you more to seek proper regulated financial advice before making that decision, because the implications can be quite wide and dip into various different areas of financial planning. So that's it. That's my 20 minutes of fame over. There's a quick summary of all the things we talked about. As Roland mentioned, all the slides are going to be available to you, I believe, after the sessions are completed in the next day or two. And I'll also be around to take questions at the end of this session. So thank you very much for listening, and I'll speak to you later.